Welcome to Trib Talk. I'm Jennifer Napier-Pearce with the Salt Lake Tribune. For every dollar an American man earns, a woman takes home 79 cents, unless you live in Utah. Here, the wage gap is just 70 cents on the dollar. So the question is, why? And a new study assigns most of the blame to discrimination, but there are some other factors unique to Utah, and joining me to talk about reasons behind Utah's wage disparity is Matthew Weinstein. He is State Priorities Partnership Director for Voices for Utah Children, the advocacy group behind the study. He's here in the newsroom, and Matthew, great to have you. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Also with us, Curtis Miller. He's an economics grad student at the University of Utah who conducted the research. And Curtis, welcome to you.
Welcome to you too. It's a pleasure to be here.
Also from the University of Utah, Professor of Economics, Gunseli Berik, whose research includes gender and development. And Professor, welcome. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for the opportunity.
And last but not least, Susan Madsen. She rounds out the panel. She's the Orrin R. Woodbury Professor of Leadership and Ethics at the Woodbury School of Business at Utah Valley University. She's also founder of the Utah Women and Leadership Project. And Dr. Madsen, welcome back to Trib Talk.
Great to be here again.
You can join us too. Do men and women get the same pay for the same job where you work? And how do you think the wage gap can be fixed? You can put those questions, comments, suggestions right here on the website. You can also tweet to the hashtag TribTalk. We're having some technical issues with the image on my screen, but the number to text is 801-609-8059. And Matthew, I'll start with you. We'll get into the data a little bit more deeply in a moment, but briefly tell us about the study and its conclusions. Why
Sure.
is Utah's wage gap the fourth highest in the nation?
So just a little bit of background. So Voices for Utah Children has had this partnership with the University of Utah Economics Department for the last couple of years, where we work closely with students and faculty on these sort of research projects. Curtis Miller, one of their top students previously as an undergraduate, now as a grad student, took the initiative, wanted to look at this issue much more closely. And so the report that we put out in January of this year documented the basic numbers, was consistent with findings that other studies have done, such as the Institute for Women's Policy Research in partnership with the local YWCA, that we have a much bigger wage gap here in Utah, and that it's closing much more slowly than in other states. And then the question that everyone asked us was, well, why? Is it because of discrimination? Is it because of factors that we can measure? And so Curtis Miller, working with Professor Gunseli, his advisor on his honors thesis, went to look at that particular question using some more advanced statistical methods. And in particular, the Oaxaca-Blinder decomposition method. And the full paper is linked on our website for folks that want to get into the details, but essentially we came to two conclusions. One is that most of Utah's wage gap, about 3/4 of it, can be attributed to what we had in the equations as the discrimination factor. And the other quarter can be attributed to the factors that we can much more easily measure, such as age, education, industry, occupation, children, marital status, the things that people generally can measure. This was using the Census Bureau database, the CPS database from the Census Bureau. And the second conclusion that we came to was that while the discrimination factor in Utah is about the same as it is nationally, if you want to understand why our gap is so much bigger than in other states, that is because of the factors that we can measure in terms of women's characteristics and qualifications, and a number of ways in which women in Utah have fallen behind women nationally and fallen behind men in Utah that explain why the gap is so much bigger here than it is in other states.
Curtis, briefly, how do you measure discrimination?
Well, what you do is you take the wage gap and you consider it as being the sum of two parts. One part is the part that you can associate with factors that you measure that are measurable variables in your data set. So that includes the stars of the show would be education, occupational distribution, industry, and so on. And you have this gap that's associated with this part. Then you have another part of the gap that's associated with men and women being paid differently. So you try to look at how the gap, you basically break it down to what the gap would be if there were no discrimination. This is the part that we associate with different attributes, education, occupation, and so on. And this other part is associated with men and women being paid differently. And the conclusion of that was that most of the gap cannot be associated with factors such as occupation and education and industry and so on and so forth. Most of it has to be attributed to men and women being paid differently, and you can also break down the gap and look at the difference between the nation and Utah, and you find again that most of this gap is associated with men and women. This gap in attributes and like education and occupation. Women tend to be less educated than men in Utah, which is opposite of what you see at the national level. And the same is, and they also have a disfavorable occupational distribution, disfavorable industry distribution, and so on. So what you find is that the reason why Utah's wage gap is so much larger is attributable to this. It's because you actually see the opposite trends at the national level. You see women are actually more educated at the national level than men. Right.
Professors Berik and Madsen, you didn't participate in this study, but generally, what do you make of the conclusions? And Professor Berik, I'll start with you.
Well, I actually commend Curtis Miller for completing this excellent study. It was produced painstakingly and carefully using this standard methodology that economists use to identify the sources of the wage gap, and it was produced over an 8-month period under the supervision of Professor Bill Gunseli in the economics department, and it's a state-of-the-art study. It obviously should not be the end point in our analysis, in our conversation, but a starting point. And I put great faith in the results. I should say that economists recognize that not every qualification difference that contributes to the gender wage gap is measurable by some of these national surveys, and including the current population survey that was used by this study. And so it is conceivable that this 3/4 of the wage gap that is sort of a residual, a leftover, and that is commonly attributed by economists to discrimination or disparate payment for same qualifications, it is conceivable that we could get that down to a smaller percentage, to a smaller share of the gap. But even in national studies, researchers find 40%. 40% of the gap is attributable to this unexplained or this sort of unmeasured disparate treatment of women and men in terms of their wages. So, really, there is something there in terms of the labor market discrimination, disparate treatment of women and men in terms of the payment of their wages. And
Professor Madsen, your general take on the study?
Yeah, I as well believe that it's an excellent study. I was excited to have someone take that on because I get asked about the wage gap all the time, and I give the information about what I know, and I know the national data, so it's great. I have a couple of thoughts. One, kind of to move forward from the last conversation, is I do a lot of research on women in leadership, globally, in Utah, nationally. And one thing that wasn't mentioned in the study, and it's not in some studies, that is probably attributed to the discrimination, is the element that women do struggle more than men with negotiating their salaries. And study after study has said that women men are 4 times more likely right out of college to negotiate their salaries, that women typically negotiate about 80% of what men do. And so then the question is, what does discrimination mean? And I teach business ethics. So we're always talking about, is it unethical that corporations, in the capitalistic society, pay men and women different? But then the companies will say, well, if they don't negotiate, whose responsibility is it? And is it truly discrimination if that woman may not have negotiated? So there's a lot of research. I just wanted to bring up that element. There's a lot of research around that negotiation, and in this study, I think that it is kind of put in the discrimination, but people would argue, is that discrimination or not? So that's one. And then the second thought I had was, as you know, Jennifer, you and I have been in touch for many years. I started the Utah Women in Education Initiative in 2009, and am glad to have some support from this study that education is important. I mean, the more women, we still need to do more work in the state in terms of women really being educated, knowing they should go to college, staying in college till they graduate and get a degree, and then just really moving forward and into those jobs or whatever choices they have. But the education piece is something that we can do something about here in Utah.
Speaking about the wage gap, and a new study from Voices for Utah Children with Matthew Weinstein, Curtis Miller, Susan Madsen, and Gunseli Berik. Again, what questions or comments do you have about the wage gap? If you're a woman out there, how do you negotiate on salary? Send your tweets to the hashtag Trib Talk. Put your comments right here. Well, let's dive right into the education part. A big part of the gap, Matthew, you found is education. 33% of Utah men have a bachelor's degree. Only 30% of women do. That's a very different story when we're looking at the national averages, right?
Well, and the other interesting development that we documented here is that over the last generation, we've seen a huge change and a divergence between Utah and the nation on this, where a generation ago, the gap between male and female workers in terms of college degrees was only about half a point between men and women, both at the national level and in Utah. But now we've seen a big gap open up in Utah and nationally, but in opposite directions. In Utah, women workers are now about 3 percentage points, as you said, behind men. But nationally, it's actually women that are ahead in terms of college degrees in the workforce, and by 4.5 points. So that is a big change just in the last generation, both nationally and in Utah.
Oh, so what happened? Susan, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, the research that I've done for a number of years has looked at when that change happened, and I agree with Matthew totally. And we started seeing a decrease in the statistics that we had through a national database, starting to decrease slightly in 1993, but it was about 2001 when we really crossed below the nation. So, throughout time, even in the pioneer days of Utah, we had more women who were going to college and more highly educated.
Well, Gunseli, what do you see happening here?
Well, I would like to comment on the discrimination component. In this study, discrimination really refers to different treatment on the job market. So difference in payment for the same qualifications of women and men. But the part that's due to the contributors due to less education and concentration in lower paying occupations and industries may also be attributed to what is called societal discrimination. These are the cultural, social factors that actually track girls and boys from a young age into certain types of educational paths and occupations and industries. And And it's sort of, obviously culture is everywhere. It's embedded in our, in our families, in our institutions, peers, community, and schools. And so you can regard these factors, which are sort of seen as, well, these are women's choices or men's choices, occupational choices. We're not going to force them into, certain, just decide occupations for them. If we leave them to their choices and this is what they choose, I sort of, I and many other economists sort of believe we have to look at this as a bigger problem and not just sort of say, oh, well, there's little discrimination on the labor market and the rest is women's choices and men's choices. So we really have to not take the choices as sort of the end point of our conversation, but a beginning point of our conversation. Why is it that women make these choices? And for different kinds of majors in college, or not finish their education and get married and have children and drop out. Why is this the case? And when you look closely, obviously we all have belief systems, believe in certain gender norms, that those are shaping our choices. But at the same time, there are institutional factors. If you have a situation where there is no paid family medical leave, no flexibility for parents to attend to their young children's needs in work scheduling and so forth, and limited affordable quality childcare. Obviously, this is also part of the institutions that are shaping those choices, and so women who take seriously care for their children and their families and see that as their main role, then of course are in a bind, and they end up in these occupations or industries or with less education that actually puts them at risk. Mm-hmm. I should add, not just immediately in terms of just unfairness of the low pay and low pay coming into the family budget, but also at risk later in life. What if that marriage does not work out when they counted on depending on a husband who would support them, a higher paying husband who would support them, or sure, some widowhood, some eventuality that resulted in their having to support themselves and their children later in life.
Curtis, I wanted to ask if culture was part of the study. Did you look specifically at some of the cultural or institutional pressures that Professor Berik had just mentioned? Is that within the scope of the study?
Well, I'm certainly aware of it, but there's no variable in the CPS that can actually measure that. Culture is not a measurable thing. But I am certainly aware of what Gunseli is mentioning, and that's something that I mentioned in the paper, or I may have, that there's a danger in legitimizing this part of the wage gap that we associate with characteristics like education and occupation and so forth, just like Professor Berik said. We shouldn't just legitimize that and say, okay, this is the part of the wage gap that's okay. As she points out, there could very well be cultural factors that are associated with those decisions, and there's a danger whenever women specialize into domestic roles, then there is a danger that later on in life they could be jeopardized by that specialization and find themselves in an inferior economic position. And
Dr. Madsen, we've talked about this before, but Utah's culture, conservative culture, and stemming, I would say, from the dominant LDS religion, has discouraged women from pursuing careers and higher paying jobs and finishing that degree. I mean, is that perception or is it reality?
Well, the most of the research that I've done has focused on why women are not graduating from college, going to college and graduating, and we definitely found some cultural factors there. For instance, we found that many of the LDS women felt they were being encouraged by church leaders to go to college, to be in college, but not necessarily to stay and graduate from college. And we also found, at least in this LDS sample, some real evidence of, and I call it a lack of they do not see a life of integration. They feel like if they're a mom, they need to be doing that full time, or when they're college before they have kids, they should do that full time, instead of, what we didn't hear in our data was, well, maybe I can go online after I have my first kid, or maybe I can go part-time. And so those kinds of things, that's the data that I've collected, really do inform those. One comment I did want to make related to an earlier conversation is I totally agree that we have, and I'm going to even counter my negotiation thing I just said, we have socialization. I mean, people get offended at that word sometimes, but we're all socialized and we have unconscious biases. And so women themselves, one of the reasons they don't negotiate is they've been socialized that women should not be as forceful or should not push in certain ways. And so I really like the comment about choices. I mean, we're all just socialized by people around us, and that's just part of the culture, but we all have unconscious biases, including leaders in companies, leaders in government, people in HR, people making hiring choices and compensation choices. And sometimes we don't know. We don't realize that it's unconscious, but we are being discriminatory in certain ways. So it's important more and more companies are doing checks and helping people understand our unconscious biases so we can get past those.
Matthew, you mentioned that the education gap has widened here in Utah. What about the wage gap over time? How has that changed?
Well, the wage gap has gradually tended to close nationally as well as in Utah, but in Utah much more slowly than in other states. And actually in this study, based on this data set, we actually found that over the last generation or so, the wage gap has not closed at all. So we've been making very slow progress. I think in our last study in January, we went back to the 1970s and found some gradual progress. But really, it's been closing at one of the slowest rates in the country here in Utah.
Is there any good news in this report, Curtis?
If there was good news, it would be that this part that we associate with discrimination is closing. That if you actually look at, Matthew mentioned that the gap is about the same as it was a generation ago. And if you look at why that's the case, you find that this discrimination factor has declined, right? This part that we associate with discrimination. It was offset, though, by these changes in measurable characteristics, education, occupation, and so forth. So in some sense, that's a better thing, because I think that these other characteristics, such as occupational and educational things, these are measurable, and therefore they're somewhat easier to fix. Whereas discrimination, there may not be any malice involved, and it may be, and in addressing that may require thinking about how we think about women. But these other factors, I think there's more policy solutions for that.
Actually, if I may jump in, obviously we have a long history of equal employment policy, equal employment opportunity policy since the 1960s, and a lot of the subtle sort of disparate treatment of women and men that remains actually can be addressed. And for example, I mean, I agree, it's sort of often unconscious. People are not aware that they are engaging in discriminatory behavior in the workplace. But for example, if upon hire, a female hire is offered a lower salary compared to a male hire, on the assumption that the man is going to be supporting a family and the woman is going to be only a secondary earner for that family, if at all, I mean, then it's sort of right there and then, upon hire, you have a discrimination produced, wage differential introduced, and often in addition to what Professor Madsen pointed out in terms of not negotiating salaries at that point of hire, that adds another dimension. But these are all practices that HR structures could stamp out. And if but they need to be cognizant and sort of perhaps nudged into these kinds of rooting out these kinds of practices. The other thing is, once you have pay differentials established especially in private workplaces, if there is no transparency in pay, and if there are rules against sharing your salary with your coworkers, and many private workplaces have such pay secrecy rules. They actually pursue workers who share their salaries. So if that's the case, there is no way you're going to find out that you're making less than as a woman compared to a coworker with similar or even less qualifications.
Well, let me ask you this, because there is sort of this campaign that the wage gap is a myth, that the reason there is a gap, if there is a gap, is because men work longer hours. So hour for hour, there's not much of a gap at all. How do you respond to that, Dr.
Can I just...
Yes.
Can I just jump in on that?
Yeah.
That was actually one of the strengths of this study that I don't want to be sort of overlooked. And basically, the Voices study, Miller's study, essentially looks at, isolates the hours effect by looking at hourly wages of full-time, year-round employees, women and men. So when you look at hourly wages, you are essentially comparing 1 hour of work here to 1 hour of work for a man. And you have an apples and apples comparison here. And these are all full-time year-round, meaning they work at least 35 hours a week and 50 weeks, at least 50 weeks per year. So this is a very specific group of workers. We don't have these part-time women in this sample. It's a very, 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 I mean, it's just, it gets as close as possible to looking at making an apples and apples comparison.
Okay, I need to interrupt because we've only got a couple minutes left, and we have to get to solutions.
Okay.
Attacks to, you have recommendations for public policy to fix the wage gap. So maybe I'll just tick through each of you. If you can take a brief moment, what would you like to see changed? And a few solutions have been mentioned, but maybe you want to elaborate. And I'll start with you, Dr. Madsen.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the recommendations I read in the report that's out there is to look at more initiatives for helping women understand they need to go to college and graduate and so forth. And I'm telling you that we do have an initiative out there already, the Utah Women in Education Initiative, that's working with all of the campuses in K through 12 as well. But we need more support for that. So that is one thing that I think would be a solution. And then I will mention as well that there in the organizational leadership, organization and leadership literature, there are studies that show absolute wonderful success with that discrimination thing that we just talked about, with practices, looking at practices, and also training and development and more awareness. And so I think we need to look at that as well as part of the solution for companies, but also in government, nonprofits, and assistance in those areas.
Curtis Miller.
I think that making, say, career counselors or counselors at schools who are advising girls in high school or in college about what they should do, what their life plans, making them cognizant about how they're advising their students and the possibility that they may advise girls different from boys, that would be helpful.
Okay.
Helping girls, helping women who are in school who have children, giving them access to resources, that would be helpful. And more public awareness about this issue. And I would also say that encouraging companies to make it easy for a woman who has a child to return back to work and to be able to support her child while she is working. That would also, if people are concerned that the wage gap is associated with women not having as much actual experience, there are studies that show that returning to work as quick, rebounding back to work after you have a child or something like that, it helps quite a bit with the wage gap.
Okay, Matthew. Go ahead.
The only other one I think that I would add that often isn't focused on, most low-wage workers in our economy are women. And so policies that boost wages at the bottom end of the economy disproportionately help women and help close the pay gap. Utah is not likely to raise the minimum wage, but many similar states have done something different that has a similar effect, creating a state version of the federal earned income tax credit, which disproportionately gives a boost to lower income women workers.
Okay, and Professor Berik.
I agree with all of these policy suggestions, and I would add family work balance policies in workplaces, and these could be instituting paid family medical leave in the state, and doing away with paycheck secrecy. I think transparency, getting light into pay structures would go a very long way if there is any, discriminatory wages that are been established and entrenched in our workplaces.
Well, the new House Speaker, Paul Ryan's talking about the work-life balance. Maybe that will get some traction. This is your study, Matthew, so I'll give you the last word. Why should Utahns care about the wage gap?
Well, Utahns obviously do care about the wage gap. I mean, this receives probably more attention than anything we do at Voices for Utah Children. Obviously, our concern is primarily children and the disproportionate effect that this has on children, especially children in those single-parent, female-headed, lower-income households. And that's something that one way or another affects us all.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there, unfortunately. Matthew Weinstein, Professor Madsen, Professor Berik, Curtis Miller, thank you all very much for your time today.
Thank you
for having us.
Again, you can find out a lot more about the Voices for Utah Children study right here at sltrib.com. Thanks so much for tuning in to Trib Talk today. We'll see you next time.